Sean Miller, a dedicated agent, never expected a routine drive home to turn his life upside down. After being wrongfully profiled and stopped by police, Sean becomes the center of a tense legal battle exposing deep-rooted racial bias within law enforcement. As public attention intensifies, he must navigate media scrutiny, personal attacks, and an uphill fight for justice, not just for himself, but for those who've suffered the same injustice in silence. Will Sean's battle change a broken system, or will the weight of opposition be too much to bear? Like, comment, and subscribe to follow Sean's journey. Let us know your thoughts below, and don't forget to hit the notification bell for updates. Sean Miller eased into the driver's seat, his mind still warm with memories from the evening. His cousin's birthday party had been a small, intimate gathering, a reminder of the simplicity of family laughter, good food, and shared stories. The streetlights flickered outside the windshield as he pulled onto the empty suburban road, the rhythmic hum of the car engine a calming backdrop to his thoughts. It had been a long day, and Sean was glad to be heading home. He was still dressed in his besta neatly pressed suit that spoke to his professionalism, a mark of his success as an agent with over a decade of service. As he adjusted his rearview mirror, the reflection of his dark skin contrasted against the white collar of his shirt caught his eye. The image tugged at a familiar thought. Even after all these years of hard work, all the ranks he had climbed, there were still people who saw only his skin color. Sean drummed his fingers lightly on the steering wheel, trying to shake the heaviness of that reality. He'd always told himself he could make a difference from the inside, that his presence in the system mattered, and on most days he believed it. But tonight, as the quiet stretch of road unraveled before him, the weight of that belief felt heavy. His phone buzzed in the cup holder beside him, breaking the stillness. It was a text from his colleague and close friend, Dana King. "Great seeing you tonight, Sean. Be safe out there." Sean smiled, tapping a quick reply. Dana was one of the few people who truly understood the complexity of his life balancing, the pride of being an agent with the constant undercurrent of racial bias that followed him, even in his own department. He pushed the thought aside, trying to focus on the road ahead. But a gnawing sense of unease crept into his chest, one that no amount of professionalism or credentials could shake. He was just a few miles from home, but the night felt heavier than usual, as though something unseen was lurking just around the bend. Sean glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was 11:47 p.m., and the streets were deserted. He loved the stillness of these late-night drives, the quiet of a world winding down for the night. But tonight the silence felt different. It felt like a shadow hanging over him. He sighed, gripping the wheel a little tighter, hoping it was just fatigue playing tricks on his mind. He was so close to home. Just a few more miles. Sean's grip on the steering wheel tightened as the soft glow of red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. His heart skipped a beat. For a brief moment, he wondered if it was just a passing patrol car. But when the sirens began to wail and the lights grew brighter, he knew better. He was being pulled over. Here we go again, he thought bitterly. Despite years of careful driving and following every rule, these stops had become far too common. Sean quickly glanced at the speedometer. He was well within the limit, the car in perfect working condition. No broken taillights, no suspicious behavior. The only thing that stood out tonight was the color of his skin and the fact that he was driving a high-end car. With a calm, practiced motion, Sean flicked on his turn signal and pulled over to the side of the road. His hands rested on the steering wheel, visible and steady, just as his father had taught him long ago. Always keep your hands where they can see them, son. Stay calm, be respectful, and make it home. His father's voice echoed in his mind, a bitter reminder of the countless conversations they'd had about survival. Sean watched through the side mirror as the patrol car came to a stop behind him. He could see the outline of two officers inside, one older, with a sharp jawline and narrowed eyes that gleamed under the streetlights. The other, younger, seemed to be following his lead. The older officer, David Ellis, stepped out first, his movements deliberate and commanding. His partner, Ryan Scott, exited from the passenger side, hanging back but close enough to signal that Sean was being watched from all angles. The knot of unease in Sean's stomach tightened, but he kept his face expressionless. He had been through this before too many times, in fact. The script was always the same pull over the black man in the nice car. Question him, make him feel small, and hope he doesn't push back. Ellis approached the driver's side, knocking on the window with a force that seemed unnecessary but familiar. Sean pressed the button to lower the window and turned to face the officer, his expression calm, his hands still resting on the steering wheel. "License and registration," Ellis demanded, his voice sharp. Sean nodded, moving slowly and deliberately as he reached for his wallet. "Sure, officer," he said evenly. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Ellis ignored the question, studying Sean with an appraising look that sent a chill down his spine. After a moment, the officer's eyes narrowed, and his lips curled into a slight sneer. "This your car?" Sean felt a flicker of annoyance, but quickly buried it. He handed over his license and registration. "Yes, it is." Ellis barely glanced at the documents before returning his gaze to Sean, his tone laced with skepticism. "Where are you coming from this late at night?" Sean took a slow breath, reminding himself to stay calm. This wasn't new, it was the same invasive, pointless questioning he had faced too many times before. "I'm coming from a family gathering." Ellis leaned in closer, peering into the car as if searching for something incriminating. "A family gathering, huh?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "What kind of family gathering ends this late?" Sean fought the urge to roll his eyes. "It was a birthday party." "Is there a problem, officer?" Ellis didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied Sean, his gaze hard and judging, as though Sean's very existence in this neighborhood was an affront. Sean knew that look it was the same one he had encountered throughout his life. The one that said, "You don't belong here." The second officer, Ryan Scott, knocked on the passenger side window, and Sean turned slightly to lower that window as well. "Is there something I can help you with, officer?" he asked, keeping his tone steady. Scott didn't respond, but his hesitation was palpable. He looked younger, less sure of himself, as though he was still figuring out how to navigate these situations. Ellis, however, had no such doubts. "Step out of the car," he ordered suddenly, his voice cutting through the night like a knife. Sean blinked, caught off guard by the sudden escalation. "Officer, I've complied with everything you've asked. I just want to understand why." "I said step out of the car," Ellis barked, his hand now resting on the holster of his gun. Sean's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had seen this before, the situation spiraling out of control over nothing. He wasn't about to give them any reason to justify their aggression. Slowly, Sean reached for the door handle and opened the door, stepping out with his hands raised slightly to show he wasn't a threat. He stood beside the car, his heart pounding in his chest, but his face remaining impassive. Ellis moved closer, sizing Sean up with cold, calculating eyes. "You got any weapons on you?" he asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. "No, officer," Sean replied evenly. "I'm unarmed. I'm an agent. My badge is in the glove compartment." Ellis snorted. "An agent, huh? That's a new one." He turned to Scott with a chuckle. "Hear that, Ryan? This guy says he's an agent." Scott's lips twitched into a weak smile, but the tension in his posture was clear. He wasn't laughing. Sean bit back his frustration. He had dealt with men like Ellis before, officers who didn't see him as a professional, but as a suspect. It didn't matter what titles he held or how many years of service he had put in. To them, he was just another black man who didn't belong. Ellis took another step forward, invading Sean's personal space, his eyes gleaming with a malicious curiosity. "You think you're slick? Don't you driving around in a car like this? Where'd you get the money for it? Huh, dirty money?" Sean clenched his jaw but kept his face neutral. "Officer, I've explained everything. This is my car. I've committed no crime, and I've cooperated fully. I'd appreciate it if this could be handled professionally." "Professionally," Ellis scoffed. "You don't get to decide what's professional here." As Ellis circled the car, his words became harsher, more invasive. "Guys like you always think they can slip through the cracks. But not tonight. Not with me." Sean could feel the humiliation rising in his chest, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had worked too hard, fought too hard to be reduced to this moment. He had dedicated his life to the pursuit of justice, believing that he could change the system from within. Yet here he was, standing on the side of the road, reduced to the color of his skin, subjected to the exact kind of racial profiling he had spent years trying to combat. Officer Ellis' taunts and condescending tone continued as he circled Sean's car, inspecting it for anything that would justify his actions. "Nice car you've got here," Ellis sneered. "Too nice for someone like you." "What? You think you're special? Just because you say you're an agent doesn't mean anything to me." Sean's patience was wearing thin, but he maintained his composure. He had been trained to handle high-pressure situations, to de-escalate conflicts and remain calm under duress. But this wasn't a conflict between equals. This was about power, about Ellis' need to exert control, to remind Sean that no matter how far he had come, there were still people who would see him as nothing more than a black man in a nice car. Ellis leaned in closer, his breath reeking of coffee and disdain. "I bet you've got something to hide. Maybe drugs in the glove compartment, or maybe this car's not even yours. What do you think, Ryan?" Officer Scott, standing by awkwardly, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should just check the ID," he murmured, avoiding eye contact with Sean. Ellis shot him a sharp look, cutting him off. "Well, check it when I say we check it." Sean's frustration simmered just below the surface, but he refused to let it show. Arguing wouldn't help. Giving Ellis any reason to escalate things further would only make matters worse. He was already too familiar with how these situations could turn out. One wrong move, one perceived slight, and this could spiral into something far more dangerous. "Officer, I've complied with all your requests," Sean said, his voice calm but firm. "I've given you my license, my registration, and told you I'm an agent. There's no need to make this into something it's not." Ellis chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "Oh, we're just getting started." He moved toward Sean's car, pulling open the door with unnecessary force. Sean winced inwardly as Ellis began rifling through the glove compartment and center console, his actions more about disrespect than any real search for contraband. Papers were strewn across the passenger seat, a mess of documents that had nothing to do with what Ellis was insinuating. Ellis ignored Sean's FBI badge sitting in plain sight in the glove compartment. It was clear he wasn't looking for anything legitimate. He was looking to humiliate, to assert dominance, to remind Sean of his place in this skewed hierarchy. After a few minutes, Ellis straightened, glaring at Sean with thinly veiled disgust. "Nothing," he spat, clearly frustrated that his search had yielded no incriminating evidence. Sean's heart raced as he watched Ellis' anger grow. He could see it in the way Ellis' jaw tightened, the way his fists clenched at his sides. This wasn't about enforcing the law anymore, this was personal. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Ellis sneered, stepping closer. "You think just because you didn't leave anything in plain sight, we'll let you walk away." Sean's stomach tightened, but he remained composed. He had seen men like Ellis before, officers who saw their badge as a tool for control rather than justice. Men who hid behind their authority to fuel their own egos, who saw black men like Sean as threats rather than equals. "I'm not trying to get away with anything, officer," Sean said quietly. "I've been cooperative from the start." Ellis' sneer deepened, and he took another step forward, his eyes filled with barely concealed hostility. "Cooperative?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You've been lying since the moment I pulled you over." Sean's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. "I haven't lied about anything. This is my car. I'm an agent. I've shown you my identification. There's nothing more to say." For a moment, there was silence. The tension between them was thick, suffocating, as Ellis' expression twisted into something darker. Sean knew that look, had seen it too many times. It was the look of a man who felt his power slipping, who would do anything to regain control. Ellis turned toward Officer Scott, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "You ever teach someone a lesson, Ryan?" Scott hesitated, glancing at Sean and then back at Ellis. "Maybe we should just let him go," Scott said, his voice shaky. "There's nothing here. He's been cooperative." Ellis' eyes flashed with anger, and he turned on his partner. "You don't get to make that call, rookie." "I do." Sean could see the conflict on Scott's face. The younger officer wasn't as hardened as Ellis, was uncomfortable with how far this was going, but he wasn't brave enough to stand up to his partner. And in moments like these, silence could be just as dangerous as action. "You think you're above this?" Ellis continued, turning his attention back to Sean. "You think you can just flash some badge and make it all go away?" Sean shook his head, his voice calm but resolute. "I'm just trying to get home, officer. I haven't done anything wrong." But Ellis wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were blazing with misplaced rage, his posture rigid with the need to assert dominance. He wasn't here to uphold the law, he was here to remind Sean that he was in charge. The air around them felt thick, oppressive, as the night dragged on. The lights from the patrol car flickered off the surrounding trees, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. Sean could feel the tension mounting, could sense the dangerous edge this situation was teetering on. "You're not walking away from this," Ellis said, his voice low and menacing. "You think you can play the system? Not tonight." For the first time, fear began to creep into Sean's chest. This was spiraling out of control. Ellis' need to prove his authority was pushing them to a dangerous tipping point, one that could have serious consequences. But Sean knew that losing his cool now would only play into Ellis' hands. He couldn't let his emotions take over not when the stakes were so high. "You can either handle this professionally," Sean said quietly, "or you can keep pushing this. But I've done nothing wrong, and I'm not going to let you intimidate me." Ellis' eyes flashed, his fists clenching. For a moment, Sean thought the officer might actually lash out, but Ellis restrained himself. Instead, he leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper. "Well, see about that." Officer Ellis stepped back from the car, frustration etched in every line of his face. He had expected this encounter to end differently, with Sean humiliated, possibly in handcuffs, a symbol of the power Ellis thought he held over him. But the absence of any wrongdoing, any evidence to support his preconceived narrative, only fueled his anger. Officer Ryan Scott shifted nervously on his feet, glancing between Sean and Ellis. Scott wasn't comfortable with how far this was going, but the weight of Ellis' authority held him in place. He wasn't brave enough to speak out, not yet. Sean stood beside his car, his body tense but his expression calm. He had faced down criminals, navigated dangerous situations, and survived encounters far more life-threatening than this. But there was something about this moment that cut deeper than any physical threat. This wasn't about life and death. This was about dignity, about his humanity being reduced to nothing more than a perceived threat. Ellis wasn't backing down, and Sean knew it. The officer's need for control, his desire to prove his authority, was pushing the situation into dangerous territory. "You're going to learn your place tonight," Ellis muttered, just loud enough for Sean to hear. The words stung, not because they were new. Sean had heard them before, in one form or another, but because they came from someone who was supposed to represent justice, someone who was sworn to protect and serve. And yet here he was, using his position to dehumanize, to tear Sean down. The street was still eerily quiet, the distant hum of traffic the only sound that punctuated the tension between them. The patrol car's lights continued to flash, casting flickers of red and blue across the pavement. Sean could feel his pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the deep frustration and anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. He had worked so hard to rise above the limitations society placed on him, to become something more than what people expected him to be. And yet, in moments like these, none of it seemed to matter. It was exhausting fighting to prove his worth, fighting to be seen as more than the color of his skin. Ellis took another step forward, his eyes narrowing as he sized Sean up. "You think you're better than me?" he sneered. "You think you can walk around here like you own the place?" Sean stared back at him, his voice calm but firm. "I don't think I'm better than anyone. I just want to get home." The calmness in Sean's voice only seemed to infuriate Ellis further. The officer took another step toward him, his body language aggressive. "You don't get to tell me what you want," Ellis growled. "I decide how this goes." Officer Scott shifted uncomfortably again, his unease growing more apparent. "Dan, maybe we should just let him go," Scott said quietly, trying to diffuse the situation. "There's nothing here." But Ellis wasn't listening. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back now. His pride, his need to prove his authority, had taken over. "No," Ellis snapped, his voice hard. "I'm not done yet." Sean took a slow, steady breath, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to get out of this situation without things escalating further. He knew he was walking a tightrope, and wrong move, one wrong word, and Ellis would find the excuse he was looking for. But Sean wasn't going to let that happen. He had worked too hard, come too far, to let this man break him. Ellis stood there, glaring at Sean, his fists clenched at his sides. The tension in the air was palpable, the distance between them charged with the weight of everything unsaid, the power dynamics, the racism, the deep-rooted fear and anger that had been building for years. For a moment, time seemed to slow, and Sean could feel the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just about this traffic stop. This was about every encounter like this, every time he had been profiled, every time he had been made to feel less than human because of the color of his skin. But Sean wasn't going to let that define him. "I've complied with everything you've asked," Sean said quietly, his voice steady. "I'm not a threat to you, and I'm not your enemy." Ellis' eyes flashed with anger, but before he could respond, the sound of another car approaching caught everyone's attention. Sean turned slightly, seeing a second patrol car pulling up behind the first, its lights flashing in the darkness. "Back up." Ellis smirked, his confidence growing as the other officers arrived. "Now we'll see who's in control." Sean watched as two more officers exited the second car, their expressions unreadable as they approached the scene. But Sean knew how this looked: a black man standing on the side of the road, surrounded by police officers, his car pulled over. He could almost feel the assumptions being made, the conclusions being drawn before a single word was spoken. The lead officer from the second car, Officer Grant, glanced at Ellis, then at Sean. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice neutral but curious. Ellis' smirk widened. "Just a routine stop. This guy's been giving us a hard time." Sean's chest tightened. He hadn't given them any trouble. He had complied with every order, followed every instruction. But in situations like this, the truth didn't always matter. Grant eyed Sean, then turned back to Ellis. "What's the problem exactly?" Ellis' expression hardened. "He claims he's some sort of agent. I'm not buying it." Grant raised an eyebrow. "An agent." Sean took a deep breath, knowing this was his moment to speak up. "I am an agent," he said, keeping his voice calm. "I've shown my identification, and I've complied with everything Officer Ellis has asked." Grant hesitated, clearly sensing the tension between Ellis and Sean. He glanced at Ellis again, then at Scott, who looked increasingly uncomfortable with the whole situation. After a moment, Grant stepped forward, his tone more measured. "Sir, if you've got identification, I'd like to see it." Sean nodded, relieved that at least one of the officers seemed willing to handle this professionally. He gestured toward the glove compartment. "My badge is right there." Grant walked over to the car, opened the glove compartment, and pulled out Sean's badge. He studied it for a moment, then turned back to Ellis. "It checks out. Has an agent." For a brief second, relief washed over Sean, but it was quickly replaced by a bitter sense of injustice. It had taken all of this: multiple officers, a badge, and a careful explanation just for his truth to be acknowledged. Even then, it wasn't about trust. It was about control. Ellis' face twisted into a sneer, but he said nothing. He had lost this battle, but Sean knew that didn't mean he had won the war. The damage had already been done: the humiliation, the power play, the reminder that no matter how far he had come, he could still be reduced to nothing in moments like this. Grant handed the badge back to Sean, his tone more professional now. "You're free to go, sir." Sean took the badge, slipping it back into the glove compartment, but his mind was racing. This wasn't over. This wasn't just about this one night. This was about every injustice, every silent humiliation, every unspoken prejudice that had followed him throughout his life. As he got back into his car, his hands shaking slightly, he glanced at Ellis one last time. The officer stood there, seething with anger, but powerless to act now that the truth had come to light. Sean didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He had already said enough. But as he drove away, the weight of what had just happened settled heavily on his chest. This wasn't just a traffic stop. This was a reminder, a painful, bitter reminder, that the fight for justice wasn't over. It never had been. And now, more than ever, Sean knew he had a responsibility to stand up and push back. Because if he didn't, who would? The drive home was a blur. Sean's mind was spinning with a mix of anger, humiliation, and disbelief. He had thought that maybe, just maybe, after all these years of working within the system, things would be different. But tonight had proven otherwise. Tonight had reminded him that no matter how many badges or titles he held, no matter how far he had come, some people would always see him as less than. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he navigated the empty streets, the city lights blurring past him in streaks of gold and white. He felt the weight of the injustice pressing down on him, the burn of it deep in his chest. He pulled into his driveway, turning off the engine and sitting in silence for a moment. The night was still, the quiet of the suburbs a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. Sean rested his head against the back of the seat, closing his eyes and taking a deep, steadying breath. He had done everything right. He had followed every rule, complied with every order, and still he had been treated like a criminal. The bitterness of it gnawed at him, but beneath that bitterness was something even more powerful, a sense of purpose. This couldn't be the end of it. It wouldn't be. He had a responsibility now, not just to himself, but to every person who had ever been made to feel small. Every person who had ever been unjustly targeted because of the color of their skin. As he stepped out of the car and walked toward his front door, Sean knew that this was just the beginning. He wasn't going to stay silent. He couldn't. Because if he didn't fight back, the flames of injustice would only continue to burn. The next morning, Sean awoke to a sense of dread that clung to him like a heavy fog. The previous night's events played on a loop in his mind, vivid and unsettling. But now, with the sun streaming through the blinds, it seemed even more absurd. Had that really happened? Had he, a respected agent, been subjected to such blatant discrimination by men who were supposed to uphold the law? Sean stared at the ceiling for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He had always been cautious about reporting incidents like this. He knew how it would be seen another black man complaining about being treated unfairly by the police. But this time felt different. It wasn't just about him. If he didn't speak up, who would? He sat up in bed, grabbed his phone from the nightstand, and sent a quick text to his colleague and friend, Dana King. "Dana, I need to talk. Something happened last night." Within moments, his phone buzzed with her reply. "Meet me at the office. I'm all ears." Sean sighed, pushing himself out of bed. The thought of reliving the humiliation from the night before made his stomach churn, but he knew it had to be done. The drive to the agency headquarters was quiet, the hum of the car's engine the only sound to accompany Sean's racing thoughts. When he arrived, Dana was already waiting for him in the lobby, her expression one of concern. "Sean, what happened?" she asked as soon as he approached. He didn't waste any time. "I was pulled over last night for no reason. They harassed me, Dana." "Officer Ellis," Sean paused, trying to find the right words. He made it clear that it wasn't about anything it'd done. It was about who I am, what I look like. Dana's face hardened. "Did you get their names? Their badge numbers?" Sean nodded. "Officer David Ellis and his partner, Ryan Scott." She exhaled sharply. "Ellis. I've heard complaints about him before. He's got a reputation for targeting minorities, but nothing's ever stuck." Dana placed a hand on Sean's arm, her voice firm. "You have to report this." "I know." Sean ran a hand through his hair. "But you know how this goes. People will say, I'm playing the race card, that I'm overreacting." Dana shook her head. "Sean, you're an agent. You have a responsibility to report this, not just for yourself, but for anyone else he's done this to and might do this to in the future." Sean knew she was right, but it didn't make it any easier. He had seen these kinds of reports get swept under the rug too many times, and the thought of putting himself in the crosshairs of internal politics was exhausting. But at the same time, staying silent felt like surrender. "I'll file the report," Sean said quietly, his voice resolute. Dana smiled softly, her expression one of both relief and pride. "Good. You're doing the right thing, Sean." He nodded, though the weight of the decision still pressed heavily on him. The road ahead was uncertain, but there was no turning back now. Later that afternoon, Sean sat in a small office at the agency, a computer screen in front of him as he typed out his official report. Each keystroke felt like a struggle, the words forcing him to relive every moment of the encounter with Ellis and Scott. The humiliation, the frustration, the fear, it was all still so raw. As he typed, he thought about how he'd often rationalized incidents like this in the past. It was easier to brush them off, to tell himself it wasn't worth the trouble. But this time, something had shifted. The injustice was too blatant, too personal, and the thought of allowing men like Ellis to continue operating unchecked made his blood boil. When he finished the report, he sat back in the chair, staring at the screen. It was a detailed account of everything that had happened, from the initial stop to Ellis' sneering comments and the aggressive posturing. It was the truth, laid bare. Sean clicked submit and exhaled deeply, feeling a strange mix of relief and trepidation. He had done what he needed to do, but he knew this was just the beginning. The fallout from Sean's report came faster than he expected. Just a few days after he submitted it, word had leaked to the media. It started with a small local news outlet picking up the story, "Agent files complaint against local officers for racial profiling." Within hours, larger news organizations were running with it, and Sean's face was plastered across television screens and social media feeds. Sean hadn't expected the story to blow up like this. He had simply wanted to hold Ellis and Scott accountable, but now it seemed like the whole world knew about the incident. He tried to avoid the news as much as possible, but it was impossible to escape the deluge of opinions, both supportive and hostile. Dana called him the morning after the story broke. "Sean, you need to get ahead of this. The media's already running with it, and if you don't tell your side of the story, they'll twist it however they want." Sean sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't ask for this, Dana. I didn't want to become the face of anything." "I know you didn't," Dana replied softly. "But this is bigger than just you now. People are paying attention. They're talking about racial profiling and police misconduct. You can make a real difference." He paused, considering her words. Sean had never been one to seek the spotlight, but now, like it or not, he was in it. And Dana was right. If he didn't take control of the narrative, someone else would. That afternoon, Sean agreed to an interview with a well-known news anchor who had been covering issues related to police reform. He hoped that by speaking directly to the public, he could at least ensure the truth of his experience was heard. The lights in the studio were bright, the cameras trained on Sean as he sat across from the anchor, Lisa Morgan. She was known for her hard-hitting, no-nonsense style, but she also had a reputation for giving her guests a fair platform to tell their side of the story. "Sean Miller," Lisa began, "you've been an agent for over a decade. You've dedicated your life to serving the public. But now, you're here because of an incident that many people say highlights a major problem in our country: racial profiling by law enforcement. Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened that night?" Sean took a deep breath, steadying himself. He could feel the weight of the moment, the eyes of the public on him, waiting to hear what he had to say. "I was pulled over for no reason," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "I wasn't speeding, my car was in perfect working condition. But Officer David Ellis decided to pull me over. And from the moment he approached my vehicle, it was clear that this was about enforcing the law. It was about exerting control, about targeting me because of the color of my skin." Lisa nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Some people have questioned why you didn't just let it go. Why file the report? Why go public with this?" "Because it's not just about me," Sean replied, leaning forward slightly. "This happens to people all over the country, every day. I have the privilege of being able to report this and have people listen. But what about the people who don't have that? The ones who are targeted, harassed, and have no recourse? I couldn't stay silent." Lisa's gaze was steady, her tone serious. "And now that the report is out, and this story has gained national attention, what do you hope to achieve?" "I want accountability," Sean said firmly. "I want officers like David Ellis to be held responsible for their actions. And I want people to understand that this isn't about a few bad apple sits, about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. We need real reform, not just for the sake of people like me, but for the future of law enforcement as a whole. The interview continued for another 15 minutes, with Sean sharing more details of the night and discussing broader issues of racial bias in law enforcement. By the end, he felt a strange sense of catharsis, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He had told his story, and now it was out in the world. The media reaction to Sean's interview was immediate. Support poured in from advocacy groups, activists, and public figures, all praising him for his courage in speaking out. Social media erupted with hashtags like Justice for Sean and End Racial Profiling, and news outlets continued to cover the story. But with the support came the backlash. Online trolls and detractors accused Sean of playing the victim, of using race as an excuse. Some said he was lying, that he was just another person trying to undermine law enforcement. Others dredged up old stereotypes, suggesting that Sean's success as an agent didn't change the fact that he was still, in their eyes, suspicious. Sean tried to tune out the noise, but it was hard. The weight of the public scrutiny was crushing at times, and even though he had known that this would come with the territory, it didn't make it any easier. Dana called him one evening, her voice soft with concern. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," Sean replied, though the exhaustion in his voice betrayed him. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. "There are people who support you. Don't forget that." "I know," Sean sighed. "But it just feels like no matter what I do, there's always going to be someone who sees me as a threat, who doesn't believe me." Dana was silent for a moment. Then she said, "That's why we keep fighting, Sean. Because people like Ellis need to be held accountable. And because the more we speak out, the harder it becomes for them to ignore us." A few days after the interview, Sean received an unexpected phone call. It was from Ethan Caldwell, a high-profile civil rights attorney known for taking on cases of police misconduct and racial injustice. Ethan had represented victims in several landmark cases, and his reputation for fearlessness and determination had made him a force to be reckoned with. "Mr. Miller," Ethan said, his voice steady and professional, "I saw your interview, and I want to help." Sean was taken aback. He had never imagined someone like Ethan Caldwell would reach out to him personally. "Help how?" "I've been following cases like yours for years," Ethan explained, "and I believe your case could be a turning point. It's not just about one bad cop. It's about systemic racism within law enforcement. I think we can take this to the next level, file a civil rights lawsuit, push for real policy changes." Sean hesitated. "A lawsuit? I'm not sure I'm ready for that." "I understand," Ethan said, his tone understanding. "But think about the impact we could have. Your case is already in the public eye. This is our chance to not only hold these officers accountable, but to push for changes that could protect others from going through the same thing. We can take this fight beyond just one incident." Sean sat in silence for a moment, processing Ethan's words. The idea of a lawsuit was daunting. It would be a long, grueling process, one that would put even more of his life under scrutiny. But Ethan was right. This was bigger than just one night, one traffic stop. "We'll think about it," Sean said finally, his voice quiet. "Take your time," Ethan replied. "But know that if you're ready to fight, I'll be with you every step of the way." Sean sat at his kitchen table, the weight of Ethan Caldwell's proposal heavy on his mind. The idea of filing a civil rights lawsuit felt monumental, but the stakes were undeniable. It wasn't just about what had happened to him anymore. This was about every person who had been unjustly profiled, harassed, or worse, by law enforcement. He knew that moving forward with the lawsuit would open him up to even more scrutiny. His life, his career, and his motivations would be questioned by people who had never experienced what he had. There would be those who would see him as a troublemaker, someone trying to undermine the system. But if he didn't act, what message would that send? The public had already seen his story. They had witnessed the injustice he'd faced. If he stayed silent now, it would be as though he were condoning what had happened, as though the system would continue without being held accountable. Sean picked up his phone and dialed Ethan's number. "Ethan, it's Sean," he said when the attorney answered. "Sean," Ethan replied, his tone expectant, "I've been waiting to hear from you." There was a pause as Sean gathered his thoughts. "I've thought it over. I'm in." Let's do this. Ethan's voice was firm, filled with the weight of the task ahead. Good. Well, file the lawsuit under the Civil Rights Act. Well, challenge the systemic issues in law enforcement, but we'll also focus on the personal impact this has had on you. We're going to make this a landmark case, Sean. Sean nodded, even though Ethan couldn't see him. I understand. We'll need to start gathering evidence immediately, Ethan continued. You'll need all your records, any documentation you have of the incident, the internal report you filed, your badge number, everything. This won't just be about what happened that night. We're going to shine a light on the broader practices that enabled it. Sean felt a sense of determination settle over him. Whatever you need, I'll get it to you. Perfect, Ethan said, his tone firm and resolute. And one more thing, Shanthus is going to get tough. The department will push back hard. They'll try to discredit you, make this about anything but race and misconduct. You'll need to be ready for that. I know, Sean said quietly. I'm ready. When the call ended, Sean stared at his phone for a moment, the magnitude of his decision sinking in. This was going to be a long fight, but it was a fight worth having. He had always believed in justice, and now he had the chance to stand up for it in a way that could make real change. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal preparations. Sean met with Ethan and his legal team in their downtown office, a sleek space filled with the hum of professionals working on high-profile cases. Sean felt a sense of both relief and nervousness as he entered the building. This was real now, no turning back. Good to see you, Sean, Ethan said, greeting him with a firm handshake. We've got a lot to go over. They spent hours going through the details of the case, combing through the evidence Sean had provided and preparing for the arguments they would present in court. Ethan was thorough, leaving no stone unturned, and Sean quickly realized just how serious his attorney was about winning this case. We'll be filing under Section 1983 of the Civil Rights Act, Ethan explained during one of their meetings. That statute allows individuals to sue state and local officials when their constitutional rights have been violated. In your case, it's clear that Officer Ellis and his partner violated your Fourth Amendment rights, the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, and your 14th Amendment rights, which guarantee equal protection under the law. Sean nodded, his mind working to absorb everything. What kind of pushback can we expect? Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. They'll argue that the officers acted within their discretion, that they were doing their job, and that race had nothing to do with it. They might even try to paint you as a threat, which is why we need to be meticulous about showing how wrong their actions were. We'll also bring in experts to discuss racial bias in policing and how it plays out in situations just like yours. Sean exhaled slowly. He had been through tough situations before. His career had required him to stay calm under pressure, but this felt different. This was personal in a way that nothing else had been. Do you think we can win? Sean asked, his voice steady but filled with anticipation. Ethan's eyes met his. Yes, but it's going to be a fight. As the weeks passed, the lawsuit was officially filed, and the media picked up the story once again. Headlines like "Agent Files Civil Rights Lawsuit Against Police Department" flooded the news, and Sean found himself once more at the center of public attention. He was inundated with interview requests, messages of support, and, of course, a new wave of online criticism from those who opposed his decision to pursue legal action. True to Ethan's prediction, the police department responded to the lawsuit swiftly and with hostility. Their legal team wasted no time in filing a motion to dismiss the case, arguing that the officers had acted within the scope of their duties and that Sean's claims of racial profiling were unfounded. Sean wasn't surprised, but the formal response was disheartening all the same. He read through the department's statements, feeling a familiar knot of frustration tighten in his chest. They had twisted the events of that night, claiming that Officer Ellis had been justified in stopping him, that Sean had been uncooperative during the encounter, and that race had played no role in the stop. It was exactly what Sean had expected. But it still stung. "We knew they would try this," Ethan said during a meeting to review the department's response. "Their strategy is to discredit you and make this about your behavior, not theirs." Sean clenched his fists. "They're lying. I was nothing but cooperative." "I know," Ethan replied. "And that's why we have the evidence to prove it. We have the dashcam footage, your testimony, and the internal report. They can spin the narrative all they want, but the truth is on our side." The department's legal team also tried to shift focus away from the broader issue of racial profiling, arguing that this was an isolated incident and that Sean's claims of systemic racism were speculative at best. "They don't want this to turn into a conversation about systemic issues," Ethan explained, "because if we can prove that what happened to you is part of a larger pattern, they'll have to reckon with the fact that this isn't just about two officers, it's about an entire system." Sean nodded, feeling a surge of determination. "I want them to reckon with that." As the legal battle intensified, so did the public's response. Sean's decision to pursue a lawsuit had sparked a nationwide conversation about racial profiling and police accountability, and his case had become a lightning rod for both support and backlash. On social media, activists and civil rights organizations rallied behind Sean, using his case as a platform to call for broader reforms in law enforcement. Hashtags like Stand With Sean and End Racial Profiling continued to trend, and public figures from all walks of life spoke out in support of his fight for justice. But with the support came an onslaught of backlash. Conservative commentators accused Sean of trying to tear down the police, claiming that his lawsuit was an attack on law enforcement as a whole. Others suggested that he was using his race as a weapon to gain sympathy and attention. Sean tried not to let the negativity affect him, but it was difficult. Every time he turned on the TV or scrolled through social media, there was someone questioning his motives, calling him a liar, or worse. One evening, Sean sat on his couch, scrolling through his phone, when a message from his brother Marcus popped up. "Ignore the hate, man. They don't know you. You're doing the right thing." Sean smiled faintly, grateful for his brother's unwavering support. Marcus had always been his biggest champion, even when they didn't see eye to eye on everything. A few moments later, Dana called. "You hanging in there?" "Barely," Sean admitted. "It's hard not to get caught up in the noise." "You're strong, Sean," Dana said, "and you've got a lot of people in your corner. Don't lose sight of that." Sean nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Thanks, Dana." He knew she was right. He had to stay focused on the bigger picture, the fight for justice. The noise, the critics, the backlash, it was all part of the process. And as exhausting as it was, Sean knew that if he gave up now, it would be like letting them win. He couldn't do that. Not now. Not ever. The day of the trial arrived with a sense of heavy anticipation. The courtroom was packed with reporters, supporters, and onlookers, all waiting to witness the beginning of a case that had captured the nation's attention. Sean sat at the plaintiff's table, Ethan by his side, as the judge entered the courtroom. His heart raced as the trial got underway, the gravity of the moment settling over him like a thick fog. The department's legal team opened their defense by reiterating their claims that the officers had acted appropriately, that Sean had been uncooperative, and that race had nothing to do with the encounter. They presented Officer Ellis as a dedicated cop who had been doing his job under difficult circumstances, and they painted Sean as someone who was overreacting to a routine stop. But when it was Ethan's turn to present their case, the tide began to shift. Ethan was a master at dismantling the defense's arguments, methodically presenting evidence that exposed the flaws in their narrative. The dashcam footage shows that Mr. Miller was cooperative throughout the entire encounter, Ethan said during his opening statement. There is no evidence to support the claim that he posed a threat or was uncooperative. This case is about more than just one man's experience. It's about a system that allows officers to target individuals based on their race without fear of accountability. As the trial continued, Sean took the stand, recounting the events of that night in painful detail. He spoke clearly and confidently, but with every word he relived the humiliation, the fear, and the anger he had felt in those moments. It was difficult, but he knew it was necessary. The defense cross-examined him aggressively, trying to trip him up, to make him seem unreliable. But Sean remained steady, determined not to let them undermine his credibility. "You're saying this was all because of your race?" the defense attorney asked, his tone sharp. "I'm saying that race was a factor," Sean replied firmly, "and that's something we can't ignore." The trial dragged on, day after day, with both sides fiercely presenting their arguments. Sean sat in the courtroom, feeling the intensity of the legal battle weighing heavily on him. Ethan Caldwell was relentless in his pursuit of justice, meticulously dismantling the defense's case with every witness he called, every piece of evidence he presented. The atmosphere in the courtroom was charged with tension. Sean could feel the eyes of the spectators, the reporters, and the jury on him at all times. He knew this trial wasn't just about him anymore. It had become a symbol of something much larger. Every question, every testimony carried the weight of the broader conversation about race and policing in America. One of the most powerful moments came when Ethan called a policing expert to the stand. The expert, a former police officer turned academic, testified about the long history of racial profiling within law enforcement. He explained how systemic bias could affect decisions made by officers, even when they weren't consciously aware of it. "Racial profiling doesn't always look like overt racism," the expert explained, his voice steady. "It's often subtler, embedded in the way officers are trained to perceive certain individuals as threats. And when those individuals are people of color, the consequences can be severe." The defense objected, of course, trying to argue that the expert's testimony was irrelevant to Sean's specific case. But Ethan countered, arguing that this testimony was crucial to understanding the broader context in which Officer Ellis had made his decisions that night. The judge ruled in Ethan's favor, and the testimony continued. Sean could see the jurors listening closely, their expressions serious as they absorbed the information. He felt a small surge of hope, maybe, just maybe, they were starting to see the truth. As the trial continued, the defense brought Officer David Ellis to the stand. Sean watched as Ellis walked to the witness box, his expression guarded but composed. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when Ellis would have to account for his actions. Ellis' testimony was exactly what Sean had expected. He painted himself as a dedicated officer who had simply been doing his job. He claimed that he had pulled Sean over because of a suspicious vehicle, not because of Sean's race. He insisted that Sean had been evasive during the encounter, which had led him to escalate the situation. But when Ethan stood to cross-examine him, the cracks in Ellis' story began to show. "Officer Ellis," Ethan began, his tone measured, "you claim that you pulled Mr. Miller over because his vehicle seemed suspicious. Can you explain what exactly was suspicious about it?" Ellis hesitated for a moment, clearly caught off guard by the question. "It was late at night, and the car was driving slowly through a residential area. I've seen that kind of behavior before, in cases where people are scouting houses for burglaries." Ethan nodded, appearing thoughtful. "And did Mr. Miller do anything, specifically, that made you think he was involved in criminal activity?" Ellis shifted in his seat. "Well, no. But I've been trained to notice when something doesn't feel right. And when you approached Mr. Miller's car," Ethan continued, "what was your initial interaction with him like?" Ellis straightened, trying to regain his composure. "He was uncooperative. He questioned why I had pulled him over." Ethan's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Is it unusual for someone to ask why they've been pulled over?" Ellis frowned. "It's not unusual, but his tone was confrontational." Ethan glanced at the jury before turning back to Ellis. "So, in your professional opinion, simply asking why he was pulled over constitutes being confrontational?" Ellis opened his mouth to respond, but Ethan cut him off, his voice growing more forceful. "Officer Ellis, isn't it true that your decision to escalate the situation had less to do with Mr. Miller's actions and more to do with assumptions you made about him based on his appearance?" Ellis' face reddened. "That's not true. I don't profile people." Ethan took a step forward, his voice steady but piercing. "Then explain to me why, after Mr. Miller provided his identification, complied with your requests, and showed you his badge, you continued to treat him as a threat." Ellis stammered, clearly struggling to maintain his composure. "I was just following protocol." Ethan's eyes narrowed. Is it protocol to ignore someone's credentials when they've done nothing wrong? Is it protocol to assume that a black man driving a nice car in a nice neighborhood is automatically suspicious? The courtroom fell silent as Ethan's words hung in the air. Sean could feel the tension thickening, the weight of the truth pressing down on everyone in the room. Ellis said nothing, his face flushed with frustration and embarrassment. Ethan turned to the jury, his voice strong and resolute. This case is just about one man's encounter with the police. It's about a system that allows officers like David Ellis to operate without accountability, to make decisions based on assumptions rather than facts. And it's about the impact those decisions have on the lives of innocent people. As Ethan returned to his seat, Sean felt a rush of gratitude. He had chosen the right person to represent him, someone who wasn't afraid to speak truth to power. But even as the cross-examination ended, Sean knew the hardest part was still to come. When the closing arguments concluded, the judge dismissed the jury to begin their deliberations. The courtroom was suddenly still, the air thick with anticipation. Sean sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he waited for the jury to return with a verdict. Ethan had done everything he could. He had presented a compelling case, exposed the flaws in the defense's arguments, and painted a clear picture of the racial bias that had shaped Sean's encounter with Officer Ellis. But now it was out of their hands. The fate of the case and Sean's fight for justice rested with 12 strangers. The wait was excruciating. Hours passed, and the longer the jury deliberated, the more anxious Sean became. He tried to remain calm, reminding himself that the length of the deliberations didn't necessarily mean anything. But it was impossible not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. Dana sat beside him in the courtroom, her presence a steady source of support. She didn't say much, but her quiet strength helped Sean keep his emotions in check. "You've done everything you can," Dana said softly. "No matter what happens, you fought for what's right." Sean nodded, though the knot of anxiety in his stomach remained. He had fought hard, but the fear of what might happen if the jury didn't see things his way was overwhelming. Would all of this have been for nothing? Would Ellis and the department walk away unscathed, free to continue operating without any accountability? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict. Sean's heart pounded in his chest as the courtroom filled with people once again. Reporters scrambled to take their seats, and the spectators leaned forward, eager to hear the outcome. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. The judge entered the courtroom, and everyone stood in respect. Sean felt a surge of nerves as he watched the jury file back into the room, their expressions unreadable. He tried to steady his breathing, to prepare himself for whatever was about to come. The jury foreperson stood, holding a small slip of paper in his hands. Sean's gaze was fixed on him, every second stretching out like an eternity. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer David Ellis, guilty of violating the plaintiff's civil rights," the foreperson said, his voice steady. Sean's breath caught in his throat, a wave of relief crashing over him. They had won. The jury had seen the truth, and they had held Ellis accountable. The foreperson continued. "We also find that the department is liable for failing to address systemic issues of racial profiling within its ranks." Tears pricked the corners of Sean's eyes as the full weight of the verdict hit him. This wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for every person who had ever been targeted, harassed, or marginalized because of the color of their skin. The jury's decision sent a clear message: this kind of behavior would not be tolerated. Around him, the courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Ethan placed a hand on Sean's shoulder, his expression one of quiet pride. "You did it," Ethan said softly. "We did it." Sean nodded, unable to speak as the emotions swirled within him. It was over. The fight, the stress, the fear, it had all been worth it. Justice had been served. But even in that moment of triumph, Sean knew that the fight wasn't really over. This was just one victory in a much larger battle. There were still countless others out there who needed justice, who were waiting for their own day in court. As Sean stood to leave the courtroom, the weight of that responsibility settled over him. He had won today, but the work was far from finished. In the weeks that followed the trial, Sean found himself thrust back into the public spotlight. The verdict had made national headlines, sparking renewed conversations about racial profiling and police accountability. Civil rights organizations hailed the decision as a major step forward in the fight for justice, while law enforcement unions decried it as an attack on the integrity of policing. For Sean, the victory was bittersweet. On one hand, he was relieved that the jury had seen through the lies and held Ellis accountable. But on the other, he knew that this was only the beginning. The system that had allowed Ellis to act the way he did was still in place, and there was still so much work to be done. Ethan called him a few days after the verdict. "Sean, I've been talking to some people in the civil rights community, and there's a real opportunity here. Your case could be the catalyst for a broader push for policy reform. If you're willing, I think we could turn this into something much bigger." Sean was silent for a moment, considering Ethan's words. He had been so focused on winning the trial that he hadn't thought much about what would come next. But now that the dust was settling, he realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. His fight for justice had resonated with people all over the country, and he had the chance to make a real difference. "I'm in," Sean said, his voice steady. "I just wanted you to know that. We'll work together on this. There's a long road ahead, but I think we can really make an impact." Sean hung up the phone, a sense of purpose settling over him. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for something much larger, a future where no one would have to endure what he had gone through. If you've enjoyed this story and want to follow along with more inspiring and powerful content, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to stay updated. Your support helps us bring these important stories to life and keeps the conversation going. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thanks for being part of this journey. "Thank you all for being here today," Ethan began, his voice steady and strong. "This center represents more than just a building. It represents a commitment to standing together, to supporting each other, and to fighting for the rights of those who have served this country, regardless of their background." The crowd applauded, the energy in the room warm and uplifting. "We've all faced challenges," Ethan continued, "but those challenges don't define us. What defines us is how we respond to them, how we lift each other up, and how we keep pushing for a better future." As Ethan finished his speech, the crowd erupted into applause. He stepped down from the podium, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The investigation had come to an end, and many of the people involved had been brought to justice. Sophia hugged him tightly, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it," she whispered. Ethan smiled, holding her close. "We did it." In the months that followed, Ethan and Sophia continued to grow their involvement in the community. The new center became a hub for veterans and families, a place where people could come together to share their stories, find support, and work toward solutions. Ryan Carter, meanwhile, had fully committed to his new role within the department, working to address bias and promote better community relations. It wasn't always easy, and he faced resistance from some of his fellow officers, but he knew that the work was important. One day, as Ryan was leaving a meeting at the department, he ran into Ethan in the hallway. The two men exchanged a brief glance, and for a moment there was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of the journey they had both been on. Ethan nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. Ryan returned the nod, a silent agreement that while they couldn't change the past, they were both working toward a better future. As they went their separate ways, both men felt a sense of resolution, knowing that the road ahead was still long, but that they were walking it in the right direction. The sun was setting on a warm evening as Ethan and Sophia sat on their porch, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. The world around them was still filled with challenges, but they had found their place in it, standing together, fighting for justice, and building something better for the next generation. As they sat in comfortable silence, Sophia reached over and took Ethan's hand. "We've come a long way," she said softly. Ethan smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "And we've still got a long way to go." Sophia nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. "But we'll get there." Together, they watched the sun dip below the horizon, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it side by side, ready for whatever battles the future might bring. If you enjoyed this story and would love to hear more like it, filled with powerful lessons, compelling characters, and deep emotional journeys, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Join our community as we continue to share meaningful stories that inspire, challenge, and uplift. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more. We're committed to bringing you stories that explore important issues, from justice to resilience and everything in between. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take on the themes explored in this story. Together, we can keep the conversation going. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video. Silver Creek was changing, and so were they. A few weeks later, the community held a town-wide celebration to honor the progress that had been made. The event, organized by Nia and Martha Sullivan, was a way to bring everyone together, to celebrate the town's journey toward inclusion and justice. The celebration was held in the town square, where people from all walks of life gathered, young and old, black and white, conservative and progressive. It was a symbol of how far Silver Creek had come, and a reminder that the town's future was something everyone could help shape. As the sun set over the square, Ethan and Nia stood together on the main stage, looking out at the crowd. The atmosphere was warm and joyful, filled with laughter and music. It was a moment of triumph, a testament to the power of love, community, and perseverance. Martha Sullivan took the microphone, her voice carrying across the square. Tonight, we're celebrating more than just the progress we've made. We're celebrating the people who made that progress possible. People like Ethan and Nia, who showed us what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. The crowd erupted in applause, and Nia felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. She hadn't done this for recognition, but hearing the town come together in support of the changes they had fought for filled her with a sense of pride and fulfillment. As the night wore on, Ethan and Nia danced together under the stars, surrounded by friends, family, and neighbors. The future, once uncertain, now felt bright with possibility. And though there were still challenges ahead, they knew they would face them together, just as they always had. As the years passed, Silver Creek continued to evolve, becoming a beacon of hope for other towns grappling with the same struggles. Ethan and Nia's love story became part of the town's legacy, a symbol of what could be achieved when people refused to back down in the face of adversity. Their journey wasn't just about love. It was about standing up for justice, for fairness, and for the belief that everyone, no matter their background, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. In the end, Silver Creek had become a place where people from all walks of life could live, love, and grow. And though the road had been long and hard, it had been worth every step. Ethan and Nia, together, had built a legacy of love and hope, one that would endure for generations to come. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about love, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on all our latest content. Thanks for your support, and remember, love and justice always prevail. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the world beyond. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. It was a beautiful day, full of possibility. And as Derek looked out, he felt a deep sense of hope for the future, not just for himself and his family, but for the world they were all helping to shape. Mia and Marcus ran into the room, their laughter filling the air as they played a game of tag around the furniture. Jessica followed close behind, her smile bright and warm. Derek turned away from the window and watched his family, feeling a deep sense of contentment. They were his reason for everything, for standing tall in the face of adversity, for sharing his story, for doing his part to make the world a better place. And as he looked at their faces, full of love and laughter, Derek knew that the future was bright. It wouldn't always be easy, but it was full of potential, full of opportunities to learn, to grow, and to create a world where empathy and understanding prevailed. In the end, that was all he could ask for. As the day wound down, Derek sat back at his desk, reflecting on everything that had transpired over the last few months. From the confrontation at the electronics store to the inspiring conversations with young people, he had witnessed firsthand how one small action could create lasting change. Every step forward mattered. He logged into his blog and drafted another post, this time focusing on the idea of speaking out, of standing up for what's right. He knew there was more work to do, always more people to reach, more stories to tell. But he felt confident that he was on the right path. As Derek prepared to hit publish, he paused, thinking of everyone who had been following his journey. If you've been inspired by this story and want to be part of a community that stands up for empathy, justice, and change, don't forget to subscribe to the blog. Join the conversation, share your thoughts, and stay tuned for more stories about making a difference one step at a time. Together we can build a future that's brighter for everyone. Satisfied, Derek hit the publish button and leaned back in his chair. The work wasn't done, but with every new subscriber, every person who read and connected with his message, he knew they were getting closer to the world they all deserved. And that was worth everything.